Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun, two of the most intimidating names one could hear. The Khan that united the Mongol tribes to form a horde that conquered lands in both Europe and Asia, becoming one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. And the Hunnic king, he used his brutal army to break down the remnants of a late Roman Empire, ravaging much of Europe in the process, being deemed the Scourge of God. Two very important and very frightening historical figures, two very skilled horsemen riding around the battlefield with bows and remarkably similar styles. No doubt nobody desired to face these two in battle, yet alone in single combat. But what if these two did? What if Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun fought in one-on-one combat? Who would win? Now these two do seem to get mixed up a lot, or at least Mulan thinks so. And it's really not surprising why. The two do have a lot of similarities, warlords that united a nomadic people and wreaked havoc across their respective geographical areas and time periods. They both conquered a large swath of land and both revolutionized archery and horseback warfare. So they are both a force to be reckoned with, very similar warriors with practically the same styles and strikingly similar stories. Let's start by introducing the combatants. First up, we have Genghis, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. He was born as Temujin in 1227 in Mongolia. He had a pretty tumultuous childhood. His father would be assassinated by their rivals and his family would be exiled. They had to live off the land to survive. There is also a rumor that he killed his brother during this time over rations. His wife and him would be taken as slaves, but after a while he would manage to escape. He gathered allies, rescued his wife, and began to unite the Mongolian nomadic tribes that had been content with warring with one another and raiding but never conquering. Genghis desired to change that. He started with China, where he conquered cities, destroyed towns, and toppled dynasties. He would go west as well, his conquest taking him into the Middle East. His brutality would often see that the Mongols could collect tribute without battle, leaving the towns untouched. If refused, or if angered, one could expect the wrath of the Khan to be unleashed. The Mongol horde killing and destroying everything and everyone inside. While he was unbelievably brutal, he wasn't just a brute, he was also a tactician and would even spare his enemies if they proved themselves valuable, giving them ranks within his military. Still, the guy did a lot more harm than good. His conquest claimed the lives of what is estimated to be as high as 40 million, killing as much as 25% of China and 75% of Iraq, around 10% of the world's population. He also had so many children by marriage or other means that it is said around 0.5% of all people alive today are descendants of the Khan. His cause of death is unclear. Theories range from falling off his horse during a hunting trip, or falling from his horse in battle, or dying from wounds sustained in battle. Either way, it seems like he died from internal bleeding. He was buried in an unmarked location with everyone in attendance said to be executed. By the time of his death, he had an empire larger than the world had ever seen, and one that remained second in scale only to the British Empire. That's quite the resume, and there's no doubt Genghis is an extremely intimidating opponent. However, his opponent boasts a similarly long list of mayhem. Attila the Hun was born in 406, some 800 years before Genghis. Now, similar to Genghis Khan's nomadic tribal origins as a Mongol, Attila belonged to another nomadic tribe, the Huns, who operated around Eastern Europe, though their origins are theorized to be in Mongolia if the similarities were not enough already. The Huns were barbarians that constantly plagued the late Roman Empire, often demanding tribute in exchange for peace. Attila was basically a precursor to Genghis Khan, a ruler that united groups of differing and bickering clans together against an enemy that was perceived as much more powerful. Taking over for their late father, Attila and his brother inherited an already sizable empire, ruling jointly for some time until allegedly Attila murdered his brother and assumed full power. I guess he and Genghis have that in common too. The Scourge of God, as he would come to be known, would raise and plunder towns in the Eastern Roman Empire. He would invade Gaul, around modern-day France, fighting the Visigoths. He would also attack Italy, gaining tribute and land. By the time of his death, Attila controlled one of the largest empires during the time. Now, Attila wasn't some dumb brute either. He was actually from a wealthy, powerful, and privileged family. He was well educated and spoke several languages, while Genghis Khan was illiterate. While he clearly loved battle and conquest, he would also award peace, especially when paid for it. Similar to the great Khans, Attila the Hun's death is shrouded in a lot of mystery. The most popular idea is that he died of a nosebleed in his sleep following a drunken stupor, or he died from internal bleeding from excessive drinking. He was buried in secret, with legends saying his wife was buried alive next to him, and all those who knew the location were executed, once again like Genghis Khan. So Genghis and Attila have quite a lot in common, and they both accomplished quite a lot as well, for better or worse. But who comes out on top if the Mongol Khan and the Hunnic king met in single combat? Well, to figure that out, we'll have to actually examine the fighting prowess of these two. Unfortunately, there's not really any primary records for the appearance of Genghis or Attila, but we can piece together a couple of things. The public image of these two is that they were both gigantic and powerful, but that may not actually be the case. Genghis Khan actually never allowed any paintings or descriptions to be made of him. Two historians who met the Khan later described him as tall and strongly built with flowing hair. It was also claimed by a 14th century Persian historian that Genghis had red hair and green eyes. Surprisingly, this may not be all that outlandish, as the Mongols were quite ethnically diverse. With Attila the Hun, we face the same issue. It's actually not known where the Huns originated from, though it is theorized to be from the Central Asian steppes near Mongolia. We also lack first-hand sources for what Attila actually looked like. Our best source comes from the 5th century Greek historian Priscus, who described Attila as short in stature with a bold chest and large head, small eyes, a flat nose, and thin gray beard. So our best description of Attila, though still not necessarily a reliable one, is that he was shorter but strong and stout. Genghis and Attila were likely not the large men their legends have turned them into, but we at least know that their size was not an issue for them. Now, both of these were part of nomadic tribes of hardened warriors who were both skilled horsemen and archers. That was a huge factor for Hunnic and Mongolian warfare, so we'll pit these two against one another on horseback with ranged weapons and then in single combat. Genghis was known to fight alongside his warriors, leading the horde into battle. We also know that he was quite capable. When he was rallying the tribes, he proved himself a formidable warrior and an even better horseman. Even as an old man, it said he would ride his horse in the battle. Genghis was a great fighter, he had to be, otherwise he couldn't have done what he did. We don't know much about Genghis the warrior, but we do know quite a bit about the Mongolian warriors, and more importantly, their horses. Now, horses were a huge part of Mongolian life. They would help forage for food, they were used for sports, and most importantly, for war. The horse was essential for a Mongol. You never wanted to be caught in battle without one. Their use allowed the Mongols to conquer huge areas of Asia and Europe. These horses are hardy, they are tough, but with enough speed and agility, incredible stamina, reliable, and bred for the harsh Mongolian elements. They sound like the perfect warhorse, and for the Mongols, they were. There's just one thing though. They were about the size of a pony. The Mongolian horse, which is said to be unchanged since the time of the Khan, is still a huge part of the Mongolian culture. Don't let their small stature fool you, it certainly didn't hold them back, and it certainly didn't hold Genghis Khan back. They were an ideal fit for the style and tactics of the Mongols. Their endurance allowed them to chase down enemies for miles, or to escape after raids, being able to ride for miles non-stop. These horses were extremely valuable for people that had to live off the land at times. The horse required little nourishment to sustain its journey, while the rider could actually drink some blood from their neck if they needed to. Their versatility was key to their success. They also put leather armor around them and metal-plated armor on their head to protect them in battle. However, while these smaller horses were perfect for the Mongols and Genghis Khan, whose actual size one has to question if he rode around on a horse the size of a pony, they perhaps never faced an opponent with similar riding and archery skills to their own. We'll see how the Hunnic version matches up in a minute. Now, after their horses, the next most important part of a Mongol's arsenal was their bows. It wasn't uncommon to see Mongols carry a few of these composite bows into battle, and paired with their horse riding ability, they could be a real issue. The Mongolian bow was by far the best bow of its time. The bows were made from layered wood, bamboo, and bone. It was very strong and heavy, requiring someone of strength and skill to handle it. But it was very flexible and was very deadly. It could reach twice as far as their enemies' bows could. They could penetrate armor, kill from a distance, and be used swiftly in closer quarters. They usually used bone for the arrowheads, but Genghis would most definitely have had metal ones. Paired with their wooden saddles designed specifically to allow mobility while riding, this combination allowed the Mongols to conquer more land than anyone else. Okay, but what if Genghis, or any Mongol for that matter, found himself horseless and standing in the midst of his enemies? What weapons were at his disposal and what armor was there to protect him? Well, just like with their horses and bows, versatility seemed to be key. Remember, the Mongols' lifestyle was part fighting and destroying and part living off the land and travel. Axes wouldn't be uncommon. They could be used for practical purposes like chopping wood, but they could also be used in combat. Still, the Mongols seem to have the mentality that if you lost your horse, you probably lost your life, so they seem to be much more prepared for mounted combat. The heavy cavalry had huge hooked lances that could pull enemies from their horses, spears to launch at those on the ground, and battle axes for closer range on horseback. They also had swords, though they seemed to be more rare, probably mainly used by infantry or units on foot. Their swords were long and slightly curved, making them ideal for slashing on horseback, as well as in a sword fight. They would also train with these weapons since childhood. Given what the Mongols had access to, Mongolian armor was well designed. Mongolian armor was intended to be durable and strong, yet light and flexible so that the rider could be protected while not compromising mobility. Their armor could start out with a silk shirt which, when hit by an arrow, could surround it, making it easier and safer to remove. They would often wear thick leather armor covering their whole bodies and then leather helmets, or in some cases metal helmets, and they could even strap pieces of metal to their leather armor for added protection. Metal scale armor, lamelier, and chainmail were rare, but Genghis would likely have access to that. The Great Khan probably had much more valuable steel armor that many did not have. Genghis is definitely an intimidating opponent, but perhaps not invincible. Let's look at what Attila and the Huns had to work with: their horses, weapons, and armor. Attila has a similar reputation. While we don't know much about him as a warrior, we know that the Scourge of God struck fear into any who was in his path. He could be ruthless and no doubt had an image of intimidation to uphold. Similar to Genghis, he likely had to earn the respect of the tribes, although he was put in a much more favorable position to succeed. He was also a great horseman, and like Genghis, probably did most of his fighting from horseback. We don't have much to go on when it comes to his fighting ability, but given his training as a noble, his assassination attempts he carried out, and the success of his campaigns, which he fought and led in, we can assume he was a great fighter and one that demanded respect. But it was all from horseback that the Huns did their damage. How does the Hunnic horse stack up to the Mongolian small but sturdy horses? Just like Genghis, Attila trained from a young age in both horse riding and combat. Similar to the Mongols, the Huns relied heavily on their horses and owed much of their success in battle as well as their fearless reputation to their steeds. Horses were so important that Attila would often bring extra horses into battle just to give the image of more riders. The Huns never left their horses during conflicts or battles, preferring to do everything from horseback. It was said that a Hun child learned to ride as soon as they walked. The Romans thought they ate and slept atop their horses, almost being like centaurs. They were just as, if not more, devoted to be on horseback than the Mongols. So what horses did the Huns ride? Well, they probably rode the same horses the Mongols did, the smaller, pony-like variety. We don't know the exact breed because, well, we don't really know what a Hun was either, but it's believed that they originated in the Central Asian steppes just like the Mongols, so they likely had the same horses. That gives both Attila and Genghis essentially the same horse, one that they both spent a great deal of time mastering. Now, it's hard to tell who was the superior horseman, Attila or Genghis, the Huns or the Mongols. They were both really proficient and used their horses to pursue and evade enemies, due to their endurance and vast amount of them, making them perfect for their nomadic barbarian lifestyle. However, while they essentially had equal levels of training and equal horses, the technology gap can make a difference here. The Hunnic horse seemed to be more expendable than the Mongolian. They may have had some leather padding armor, but probably not to the value of the Mongols, who could have had metal protection. The Mongols were known to target the unprotected horses of their enemies, taking them out while their own horses were protected. Just like how the Mongols used their composite bow to take out enemies before they even had a chance to fight back, 800 years earlier the Huns did the same. Stronger and more versatile than that of their enemies, such as the Romans. It was made of wood and some bone and had quite the range to it. They could fire as far as 300 meters and be lethal at 150. Still, that's only about half the range of the Mongolian counterpart. Though they were pretty accurate too, and this soon became a big issue for those in their path of destruction. Still, what we're seeing here is the Huns being skilled in horse riding and archery, but just a bit behind on the technology. 800 years will do that. So what about their weapons and armor? Can Attila get an advantage here? Well, once again, we see weapons being geared more towards horsemen and cavalry. They really didn't want to be caught without a horse, and preferred to use their bows. Huns had in their arsenals types of spears, axes, swords, and even lassos. Their swords were straight, like a short sword similar to that of the Romans. Now, Attila is said to have the best weapons. There is a legendary sword said to belong to Attila, the Sword of Mars. Though it's a bit on the exaggerated side perhaps, still the sword was a symbol of Attila's power. And while legends say it was crafted from meteorite and iron, it was still inferior to the steel that Genghis Khan likely had. For armor, the Huns, if they wore any at all, typically wore leather armor as it offered increased mobility. Metal-based armor like scale or lamellire, both of which are made of small metal plates, were around, but they weren't too popular with the Huns. Attila likely wore durable yet inferior leather armor. Now these armors could serve their purpose for the Huns, still they don't hold up well when compared to the Khan's more advanced armor. Okay, so that gives us about what we need to know to make these two face off. They are remarkably similar, very skilled horsemen and bowmen with great horses and composite bows, both excelling in mounted combat but not being too accustomed to close quarter combat, but no stranger to it either. They both have decent and adequate weapons and armor, at least for their respective time periods, and that seems to be the primary difference. So if both of these were riding around Eurasia alone and happened upon one another, what would happen? Well, both of these would try to fight in a similar style. They would ride around each other, preferring to keep distance and fire their arrows. Now they may be of equal skill in riding and horseback archery, but Genghis has an advantage here. He has the superior bow and armor, so it puts Attila on the offensive. The Hunnic ruler would likely have to get closer to the Great Khan as his bow has inferior range. It would also put him at a greater risk as he and probably his horse too have armor that makes them more vulnerable to the Mongolian bow. Genghis could potentially take out Attila's horse or Attila himself while Attila can't even get a clean shot in. Both of these fighter strategies revolve around circling and keeping a distance from their enemy, firing arrow after arrow. So Genghis is right in his element, but Attila isn't afforded that luxury, having to pursue Genghis to close the gap, which he does not want to do. He's at greater risk. It's also hard to close that gap when they have essentially the same horse, meaning that he's always at the same distance. So here Genghis would likely win, but let's go further. What if Attila proves a more skilled rider and closes that gap? He avoids the arrows or his armor somehow holds up. What now? Well, his own bow won't be more effective than Genghis's against the superior armor than Genghis is to his. So that's out. Okay, they drop the bows and move on to more mid-range weaponry. Well, again here Genghis has superior equipment. His lance, spear, or battle axe will be much more sturdy and of better material than whatever spear Attila would have. Attila's iron weapons will not have the same penetration against the Khan's steel armor that Genghis's steel weapons will have against Attila's leather. But either would have a monumental advantage if they could dismount the other, and that's exactly what Attila would have to do. So to dismount the other one, Attila has his lasso, and Genghis a hooked lance. Both of these could be effective depending on the range, but Attila would have a harder time swinging that lasso around than Genghis would with his lance. But if either of these could manage to dismount the other by pulling them off or tripping their horse, they would easily have the upper hand. It'd likely mean game over. Still, Genghis Khan would have a much easier time doing so than Attila, and the majority of the time would dismount him first. If Genghis dismounted Attila, he would be at the Great Khan's mercy, but let's hypothetically say that Genghis thought that the Scourge of God fought admirably and earned a one-on-one duel, so he dismounts his horse. Let's give them both a sword. Attila his legendary sword of Mars, and Genghis a standard Mongolian curved sword, neither with a shield. And it's once again here that we see steel beat iron and leather. We don't know who the better swordsman is here, but given the superior armor, Genghis would again probably come out on top. So the winner of this matchup is Genghis Khan. It's not that Attila's ability is inferior to that of Genghis's, it's that he's 800 years behind in terms of weaponry and armor, and he's at a distinctive disadvantage from the start. Due to this, Genghis is the only one who gets to fight the battle his way, in a style both of them prefer, keeping a distance and firing arrows. If both were given the same resources, it'd be impossible to tell who wins. The two are so similar in their styles, right down to the horse. They both essentially want to fight the battle the same way, but only one can. Regardless of Attila's skills, it's just not enough to overcome the technological gap, and that's the big takeaway here. Really, when you look at this, it shows how much technology can impact the battle. And while we may not imagine such a difference in weapons and armor being so significant when talking of these two, it really is, and here it's the deciding factor. Really, the similarities between the two are uncanny. Both of these built their tactics around what they had to work with. The Huns and the Mongols being nomadic tribes meant that they could move freely and ravage civilizations nearby, without much need for defense. Their horses were an extension of them and gave them an ability to live off the land, fight with an advantage in battle, as well as pursue and flee, making travel such an advantage. They both accomplished what they did, their victories and even their horrible deeds through these means, in strikingly similar ways, and built empires and built reputations of fear and savagery that immortalized the names Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan. Thanks for watching. Let me know who you think would win this matchup. Do you agree with my choice of Genghis Khan, or do you think Attila the Hun could emerge victorious? And also, let me know who else you would like to see matched up next. I'll see you next time.